Good morning and welcome to Demystifying RPO, Recruitment Process Outsourcing. My name is Christine Nicholas. I'm the CEO of People Science. We are a recruitment process outsourcing and a recruitment consulting business working in this field since 1997, which makes us 14 and a half years old. I appreciate you listening in today. I hope that we can give you some good information. This is obviously a topic that both myself and Charlie, who's with us today, our Senior Vice President of Development, and Kathy Spellis, our Director of Operations, is on the line as well. One of the reasons they're on the line is we are in the Northeast, and in case you can't tell, my voice has been coming and going because we wear our colds here as a badge of honor since we've been hit with a lot of snow. So we appreciate your patience, and we hope that we can give you some good information. I'll encourage you to ask questions using the chat to your right of your screen throughout the process, and as soon as we can get to them or we have a good pause, we will get to them. We've also left time at the end of the presentation to address them. So, talking about RPO, and this presentation is really designed for people who know somewhat about RPO or have heard the term RPO or have an interest in RPO. What we've done is put together a culmination of information that we've learned, not just from our own experiences, but from working with approximately 1,000 people within the RPO arena that we talk to every month or correspond with every month. So this information has come from our own personal experience, from our recruiting consulting experience, from working with the RPO community in general, from talking to prospects that are out there, from demographics and studies, and some other features, geographic. Today we're going to take a look at, just flip to our agenda. So first we'll talk about RPO, the definition, which is actually quite controversial at this point. And then we'll look at what are the top reasons for RPO and why it's chosen. The overall model of RPO, how does it fit into HR? The varying degrees of RPO, and this that topic really will talk about what are the different types of RPO providers that are out there and the different types of RPO work that can be done. Then we'll move on to how does RPO work, and we'll talk specifically in the beginning about the recruiting continuum, which is all the elements of recruiting, what happens within recruiting itself. And we'll use that as our cornerstone to move on to how RPO works. Then we'll talk about the solutions that RPO can provide to an organization and that has been known to provide and that it can provide. Effectiveness is RPO. This particular slide will talk about where we've seen RPO be effective and where we've seen it not be so effective. We firmly believe here that you can't talk about what RPO can do unless you can talk about the things that it can't do or where it hasn't worked. Fortunately, since we have a past now, we're able to say, be a little bit more judgmental on where RPO works. So one of the things we'll talk about today is where is it effective and where has it not been effective. The different types of RPO that are available, I know it sounds a little bit redundant, but the truth is that there are different types of RPO, and we'll show you different models that we've seen that have worked. Is RPO right for our organization? We do have a self-survey that many customers and potential customers and people just exploring RPO have found helpful that we'll provide to you today. And we'll talk about how you fill those gaps. We'll look at pricing models, how RPO prices itself, and different types of contract positions, and then, of course, open the floor to questions. So moving right ahead, RPO defined. Recruitment process outsourcing is a quickly growing avenue for sourcing and retaining top talent. That's a very general and broad statement, but it is a new and revolutionary piece. We're going to look at a slide in a second of recruiting that's come along. It's easier to look at it, I think, if you take a look at HRO, human resource outsourcing. So if we look broadly at the field of human resource outsourcing, we say there's segments within human resource outsourcing. There's compensation, there's benefits, and then there's recruitment. So if we look at recruitment as a standalone entity within the HRO world, we see the RPO world. And really that's where the title of RPO, although RPO work and partnerships have been in place before the title was coined back in 04, 05, it is, one of the ways to identify what it is that we do. Typically, an RPO has a definitive scope of project varying from becoming a full recruiting department to assuming the responsibility for meeting hiring objectives for a specific department, location, or segment of employment. Let me just paraphrase that. I think one of the biggest misnomers in RPO is that I'm outsourcing my recruiting to a company and it's leaving me. I'm tying in somewhat, but really, frankly, this company is taking over all of my recruiting. When you take a close look as we move forward, you'll see that that's not typically the case at all with RPO. And I think that the term outsourcing in itself is a little bit scary for most people, especially if it's in the field that you're in. And we'll talk about how that compares to the C-suite and upper management, chief human resource operators, CEOs, CFOs, and then how that funnels down in just a minute. So RPO in itself has a broad definition. If you take a look at the Wikipedia description, you'll see that the RPO Association has created one. Even that had a lot of controversy. Being a significant underwriter of that, I can tell you that RPO definitions vary. The important thing and what we hope that you gain today is a broad look at what RPO can do, and then a good idea of how it would fit in for you and your company, if it would fit in for your company, and what that would mean to you. So what are the top reasons that we've seen that RPO has been chosen as a resource to meet of needs? The first and foremost, and we're going to give you a good solid list here, and I will tell you that we have aggregated them based on what's the most prominent. So typically the first thing we see is there's a new need for recruiting talent, and the talent is not necessarily in-house at that point. Where there's a larger need, of course, there's always more exploration. So companies that say, we know that we need a certain particular type of recruiting talent and don't have access to it are likely to take a look at RPO and likely to choose one. Scalability kind of goes hand in hand with, do we have the talent? Companies that are in a situation where they feel they're going to have a continuous growth, a quick growth, feel like they don't have a grasp on growth, or have an extraordinary large temporary contract spend, are very likely to take a look at RPO. It's easy to measure it there, and we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. Reduction of contingent and retained search costs. Where there's a large contingent and retained search cost, there's typically opportunity for reduction in charges. That usually will draw attention to the possibility of an RPO. And quite often it's easy to measure dollars and cents. If I'm paying 15 to 20% per hire, I can easily translate that into what type of cost savings. So in the past, we've seen that's been a key indicator of whether or not an RPO is looked at, evaluated, and then chosen. Reduced overall cost of hire. One of the consistent factors in companies that look at RPOs is that they're concerned about, or that they'd like to discover exactly what is my cost of hire and can an RPO save me in my cost of hire measurement. Quite often that is the case. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but certainly cost of hire is a big consideration. Another reason they're chosen is to relief of tough recruiting segments. In our opinion here at People Science, some of the best work that we see done is when there's a very, very tough recruiting segment. Could be because there's continuous turnover. I was watching a presentation by AMC the other day, and they were talking about they had 124% turnover rate in their clerks that work in their movies, in their movie theaters. Starting, with 184, dropped to 124, and now we're at 84%. Is that a tough recruiting segment? I would argue yes. Is it tough to find 17-year-olds that will work at the movie theater? Probably not, because based on last year, they had 1.4 million. I believe the number is 1.4 million candidates. Getting them and then getting them through the pipeline, getting them to stick, that's another story. So relief from tough recruiting segments. And just while we're on that note, to make another comparison, engineers, for example, have long been a tough recruiting segment. There's bigger demand in the U.S. for the type of talent that's out there. I think most of us in engineering will agree with that. So where we go from 17-year-old movie theaters that are just entering the workforce that don't require an exceedingly large talent base, but some good innate skills, we could take this RPO and apply it over into the engineering group, which of course is going to have more specific need. So where you might be sourcing 1.4 million candidates to dig through for theaters, you might be sourcing 20 for a year for one particular segment in engineering. And that gives you a good idea of the scale of the differentiating scale of RPO and where it can be used. Create a well-planned and managed recruitment strategy. This particular line comes to us specifically from upper management, either CEOs, CFOs, CHOs, that are saying we really need a well-planned and managed recruitment strategy. In the preparation of this presentation, we were talking about, so when we see this happen at the C-suite, we don't always see it materialize into an RPO because once this idea is put into place, it doesn't always funnel down effectively, which is interesting. But we do see the C-suite take a very big interest in, they'd like to see a better plan and managed recruitment strategy. Now, once they roll their sleeves up and start to find out more, then the differentiators come in that say, hey, we do have a plan and this is what we need to add to. So as we move forward, we'll look at how does RPO fit into that big picture. But certainly to create a well-planned and managed recruitment strategy is what we hear from the C-suite. Enable the company to focus on core business. particularly with companies that have grown quite quickly, that we've personally worked with and those that we're talking to and some case studies that we've looked at. When a company is going to grow quickly and their core strength is, let's say, creating widgets and importing them from China, yet they need design engineers throughout the world globally, then they want to concentrate on what it is they're doing and have somebody else attract the talent into the business. And companies that are growing quickly don't always have the time to scale up, find an HR talent acquisition lead, put that person in place, give that person the time they need to build an acquisition team. So enabling the company to focus on its core business is crucial. And also, as we look at outsourcing trends, establishing your core business, focusing on your core business, and then determining, is recruitment something that you consider part of your company's culture and core business? I will tell you that we have met with companies where we talk to them, we come in and do an evaluation, sit down with them, and they tell us, we find out and discover that they do have the innate talent to do this. And maybe they need to augment some pieces, but frankly, they do have the internal core business. It is part of their core business, and they should stick with it. And then there's other companies where they say, hey, and after an evaluation, we realize that their core competencies are outside of recruitment, and they'd like to look at an even more entailed RPO. Enabling HR to concentrate on strategy, probably one of the best reliefs that we see when we come in as an RPO partner, or we've seen companies move over to RPO partnerships, is this now allows HR to truly come to the table. Everyone in HR, we've heard that term repeatedly. I like to come to the table. HR wants to come to the table. How can I become more of a strategist? That's always interesting, isn't it? How do you become a strategist when you're busy trying to collect headcount from departments that haven't gotten it, and then trying to come up with a plan and trying to be reactive to recruitment as it keeps changing? When you move over to an RPO model, a lot of that highly transactional, a lot of the metrics become available to you that put you in a position, put your HR department in a position where they now can truly become this client service partner, really aligning themselves with the business, really creating good internal strategies and work. Because the lackluster, tiny, minute, passion-needed pieces of recruitment go over to the RPO provider. We often say, imagine what could be done if you weren't always in this reactive mode. And that's exactly what happens in a good RPO relationship. A lot of this heavy lifting, a lot of this, where do I find the candidate, a lot of this reactive behavior goes over to the RPO, which enables you to become more of a strategist and your team as well. Reduced time to fill, another key element. The tragedy of reduced time to fill, to me, is that when we hear this, it typically does not necessarily come from HR. Someone from operations, a CFO will come and say, hey, we have a huge need to fill these positions. It's taking too long. As an RPO provider, can you help us? So in talking to HR groups in particular, we're happy to see that HR is now more aware of this. And we don't ever like to see it get to the point where operations comes to the RPO provider. So working in advance of that, if you take a look at your time to fill and you're suffering through a time to fill, typically for a myriad of reasons, an RPO can certainly help you reduce that. I don't know that in the 14 years we've been doing this, we've seen any RPO relationship, whether it was fully effective or not, that did not reduce time to fill. So that's certainly a key piece that you want to take a look at. Obtain higher levels of talent. So if you're existing at one talent level and you know that your business is demanding a higher talent level, or maybe you said, hey, we've done a good job with this, we now need to move to another level. Bringing an RPO in can give you a lot of different concepts, a lot of different ideas. It can even give you a specialty type of recruiting that you haven't done before, don't know internally. So a lot of times an attractor will be to obtain different or higher levels of talent. And improve the candidate experience. There's been a lot of talk. Isn't it a goodwill thing to do, right? It's good to make our good about us. But if you can imagine, especially in our business, consumer to business product services, your candidate is actually your customer. So the experience that they have through the recruiting cycle has a huge impact on your sales. So let's say, for example, I apply for a job at the Gap. I don't really hear much back from them. I don't get some kind, not that this has happened, by the way, use all my disclaimers about the Gap, but that I walk in, I apply for a position, I don't really hear back, or I go into a black hole, or I get a typical letter, but I'm enthused about the Gap product. That's why I'm there in the first place. So I don't really hear back, or I do hear back, and I'm shunned. I don't receive the position. Now I'm in a situation where I have the opportunity to go to Abercrombie, or I can go to the Gap. More than likely, your candidate's going to wind up at Abercrombie because they feel somewhat inhibited by the fact that they've been turned down by the Gap. So it's how you handle that candidate experience makes a difference. I will tell you, in the past 3 years, we've seen a marketed increase in customers requesting RPO relationships just to handle the volume of incoming candidates, particularly as it relies on business-to-business services. The other point that I'll mention at this time is, as we look at recruiting, and if you attend the rest of the HR.com seminar, you'll hear more about recruiting coming up in the next 5, 10 to 15 years. It's moving more and more over towards reputational hiring. So as we see candidates coming out of school, and as we look at what will that relationship be with potential candidates in the future, they want to know about individual companies. Some may even say that our days of using seeking boards and outreaching are becoming a lot more limited. That candidates coming out are getting to know their clients better, or their potential hiring companies better, and positioning themselves to work for a specific customer. The way your candidate base feels about you will depend who your hires will be in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years moving forward. So as social media becomes a bigger picture, if you haven't checked out your company on Indeed.com yet to see what your potential hiring people are saying about you and your candidates are saying about you, it's a good place to go. But that candidate experience is becoming more and more critical to the success of companies gaining the right type of talent. So those are the top reasons that we see RPO is chosen. Here's just an overview model of what it looks like within HR. We put this together because, again, a lot of the stereotyping around RPO that we hear is RPO comes in and must consume all of my recruiting. If you start to take a look at it in comparison, this is just from the big picture. Well, here we are as an organization. We've got contingent recruiting. We've got temporary employees. We've got internal recruiters doing recruiting. We've got contract recruiters. And we have room where we have an RPO over here. If you start to look at it kind of linear, how do we bring candidates in and look at it more objectively, it helps you give a better view. So the varying degrees of RPO. A few years ago, we started to notice as more and more providers got into the space and RPO became more and more popular, a lot of questions came up about what is RPO really, which I'm sure is one of the reasons that you're here today. And back in, I think it was 2006, we created this program, Demystifying RPO, which of course has changed a lot, for the Society of Human Resource Management presentations that were done. And one of the things that we noticed is we could start to self-identify within RPO different types of providers and realize that it's a very large arena and there are a lot of different companies. So you've got staffing industries, staffing companies that are now into it. We've got consulting companies that are getting into RPO. Are background companies considered an RPO? Are assessment companies considered RPO providers? What exactly is an RPO provider? And then, of course, there's pure play RPO providers and consultants that make recommendations about providers. It can all become a bit cumbersome. So we created the funnel to kind of give you an idea. So the funnel represents candidates coming into your organization, and it also represents your organization. So if we look at the first tier, or first degree RPO, we used to call this, and still do from time to time, technology provided candidates. So as technology has increased, you can align yourself with an organization that can go out, use technology to bring you a large amount of candidates. So for example, a global delivery company that we talked to a few weeks ago hired an RPO company because they were starting a new call center and they felt like they had the internal wherewithal to screen the candidates, but they wanted to bring about 200,000 resumes a week into this call center to review to make a total of about 6,000 hires. They went out, found an RPO provider that solely went out, used technologies, and brought in a huge amount of resumes for them. That would be one example of first degree. So first degree RPO really provides a large funnel of candidates, or at the top of the funnel. RPO is a provider that will come in, do the first part, do use the technologies, bring in a lot of candidates, bring in as many candidates as needed for a particular position, and then do a short screen. By a short screen, that can be as entailed as them going all the way through to a first or second interview, but not necessarily connecting what they're doing with the business, so to speak. So if your objective is to create a better customer satisfaction rating, and you're working with a second degree RPO, they may not know that, but they may know that you need them to screen for certain pieces of the interview process. Now, a third degree RPO is really a combination of the first level, the second level, and then goes even deeper in. Does this mean that it takes over more of the work of the organization or more control? It doesn't necessarily take over more control, but the third degree RPO providers are tied to the business objectives. That's one of the key pieces, that they're more of a consulting partner as well as an active recruiting partner. And that's probably the best way we can describe it. Is it necessary for you to say, oh, I need a second degree RPO? No, we're really basically not trying to categorize RPOs. We're trying to give you, the potential buyer, or those people of interest in RPO, an idea of how we can best explain the different avenues of RPO. All right. So how does all this work? This is, People Science created this some time ago. I'm not sure if you've seen it. I know that this is a popular piece that's been out there for a while. This is a recruiting continuum. And actually, we founded this when it turned out that a customer quite a few years ago came to us and said, hey, we outsourced our recruiting to you. You did a great job. We don't know why we couldn't have done that ourselves inside. As it turned out, it was a very large scale-up piece. But we were able to say to them, go back and say, okay, why was it that People Science had so much success in this arena and the company didn't have as much success themselves? So we take a look at recruiting as a whole, and we say these are all the elements of what occurs in the recruiting process, starting with defining and attracting, recruiting, applicant processing, interviewing, background checks, onboarding and orientation, employee performance measuring, analysis, and communications. And what we found is there was a direct correlation between very successful recruiting initiatives when these pieces together simultaneously, not one more important than the other, were very effective. So when we compare this to those effective groups, defining and attracting, they were doing a great job at that. We'll look at some of these elements in a second. At recruiting, they were doing a good job at recruiting. All of these, I would say, were running over the 50 percentile, up to 100% of efficiencies. So when an organization can take the recruiting continuum, understand it, do an analysis of themselves, and then assure that they're meeting those needs and bringing their efficiencies up, they're going to have a very effective recruiting resource. If you have questions about the continuum, we will get to that a little bit later too. So as we look at the continuum and how it plays into RPO, it's a good cornerstone to start out talking about the different types of RPO. So here's how it works. And this is the continuum. We've just kind of broken it down a little bit more for you. If you look at the legend over to the bottom left, you'll see the client company we're denoting in red. The provider we're denoting in shared. So what we mean by this is where you see these red, for example, the client company, onboarding and orientation, employee performance and measuring. This is in this particular RPO partnership, and this is a sample of an RPO partnership as it relates to the recruiting continuum. Ownership of these two pieces belong to the company. Now, by ownership, I mean they operate the daily, everyday, today pieces of this particular relationship. So if we move over to the next slide, we see that in this case, the purple pieces are owned by the RPO provider. So does that mean that there's no interface? No, there's definitely an interface with the company, but the responsibility, the overall accomplishment, the ownership falls back on the RPO partner. So recruiting, interviewing, background referencing is falling over to them. And as we move to the last slide, we see that defining and attracting, applicant processing, analysis, and communication, these are shared pieces. So when you look at the continuum as a whole, the onboarding and the employee performance is being owned by the client company. The recruiting, interviewing, background reference checking is being controlled by the provider. And then being shared is defined the applicant processing, analysis, and communication. So you can see the flexibility of RPO. Now, have we seen situations where the entire piece is outsourced? Yes. They're very far and few in between. But we do believe that there needs to be a firm ownership in any case of what plugs in and how it plugs in. So how does it work? And these are some of the solutions that can be provided. So we talked earlier about what are some of the pain points or some of the reasons that RPO is chosen. And these are some of the things that come out of RPO. One of the most surprising things about RPO is that companies will almost always enter with one idea. We have a tough spot. We've always had transition issues in this position, or we've had a high turnover rate in this position. And then the value-added services that come along with an RPO are so significant that other pieces come up. So we thought it would be beneficial to say, kind of give you a breakdown of what those are. So let me get back a second. Increased pipeline. So you'll see a natural increase in the pipeline of candidates because once you start to run at optimum efficiencies, going back to that continuum, you're going to see an increase in candidate pipeline. Increase in the quality of candidates. The more attention the more focus you put on the little pieces, the easier it is to bring a better quality of candidate in, the easier it is to become more finicky in candidates, and the easier it is even for your recruitment advertising companies to understand what's needed by the organization. And as you present a better slate of candidates to your hiring managers, they'll start to become more selective in who they choose to. And increasing quality candidates is always a good side piece. Shortening training periods. We thought this is one of the most interesting pieces out there. As human resources or as recruitment ties in so closely to training, especially in RPO relationships, we've seen that those training periods decrease because of the quality of the candidate or the match. Not even the quality of the candidate, but the match of what the candidate, of what the company needs, tags in easier to what the training group is looking for. And as those two come together, that becomes even better, which shortens your training period. Employment planning. And imagine if you had your finger and you knew it takes us 32 days to get a person from the initial requisition on board. Or it takes us 32 days to create a slate of 6 qualified candidates for one interviewing manager. That's the type of microdata that's provided, yes, from ATSs, but not always in the kind of detail that you need. Or actually, historically, what we hear is companies might have an ATS, but in order to enter all that data, you need to add a whole other crew to begin with, which is where the RPO provider can come in. So an RPO provider gives you such microdata that planning becomes much easier. You know, when we take a poll of hiring managers at the end of the year, the beginning of the fourth quarter, the end of the year, we say, what's your headcount look like? It's kind of like budgeting, right? Everybody runs. You know, oh, I'm getting to it. Oh, I'm going to get to it. Oh, here, and you always have one all-star, 2 all-stars. Say, here's my headcount. I know what it is. And typically, when you look at those people, it's because they have metrics to base it on. So providing your hiring managers with good metrics is going to allow them to start to make decisions on headcount, and then better planning takes place. Trend observance. We've actually entered into RPO agreements where the hiring company is looking for trends within their segment. So they'd like to know, what is the competition doing? Who is our competition when it comes to recruiting? How can we build a bigger, diverse workforce? Because of the metrics that are collected in certain RPO relationships, that data is able to translate into what is going on in the business in general when it comes to recruitment. And again, talking about what's going to happen in recruiting in the next 5, 10, 15 years, a lot of trend observance is what's going to be needed for those strategy people in recruitment. Data for more accurate forecasting, that's what we just talked about. Increased employee referrals. So there's been many studies that show that referred employees quite often can bring a lot of value to the company, and they're easier to source and they're less cost per hire. Now, we've entered into situations where it really is not the case, where the company, in fact, is trying to get away from referrals. But if you are trying to increase your employee referrals, understand that the way you treat your candidates coming in will decide whether or not they'll recommend you over. Social networking is a good tracer on this because you'll see quite often in any one of the job boards or even on LinkedIn, recommend this to a friend. One of the highest recommendations a company can get is, I'm recommending my job or this job to you as a friend because this company looks interesting. When you really operate it well, people feel good about a company, recommend a company. Employee retention. Hire them better up front, get training on board with you, manage them the right way, and you have good employee retention. One of the most interesting things for us is when we first went offshore in our screening process to call center environments where there was, they were being managed, they were being trained well, but they weren't being screened the way they were being screened onshore. When we applied the screening to the offshore vendor, it was very interesting to see the quality of the candidate come up considerably, and then in the end, the customer satisfaction come up considerably. So your employee retention is one of the biggest pieces that you'll see come together almost. One of the first indicators that you'll see come up higher should be your employee retention. Reduced advertising costs. So when you've got the good metrics on the end and you really do know where they're coming from, you're not just subject to what the internet is telling you or what the ATS is telling you, but it's really good quantified data. Then you're able to go back and say, where should we be spending and getting the biggest bang for our buck? Increased HR effectiveness. This goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier. Taking away the lackluster pieces or the pieces that are not part of the core competency of your recruiting team, not just the organization, but where you feel you don't have the internal core strength as a recruiting organization, and outsourcing and having the right RPO provider provide the passion around that gives you the benefit to become that strategic partner. Reduce cost of vacancy. There's been a lot of talk about cost of vacancy, but if you really want to build a business case for your own efforts, whether it be RPO or not. Take a look at how much it really does cost the company to have one particular candidate space open. This is a remarkable number. So if you haven't looked at this yet, I strongly suggest that you do. You'll see we will have, People Science will have more data coming out in the next couple months, which you're welcome to go to our website and register to receive our TAT report, our Talent Acquisition Today report, that talks about how do I determine cost of vacancy and what role does that play. But cost of vacancy is a huge portion, especially these days as workforce has shrunk, and now we're saying how much work is truly getting done as things move into a different direction. So we'll encourage you to make sure you take a look at that. I will tell you that we've built entire business cases for companies around their cost of vacancies. Employment efficiency rates. So if you want to see your employment efficiency rates go up, or how does that engineers, bringing this particular engineer into the organization, how does that affect the overall research and development, and where does that position us financially as an organization in the next 2 to 5 years? I mean, there's some interesting numbers you can work with. So when you bring the right talent into an organization, it changes the way the organization functions. And with that idea of I can really bring the kind of talent that I'd like to into my organization, hit your mid and upper management people, it changes the way they will do business. So this product that they thought that maybe was not attainable because they didn't have a venue to attain that type of individual will start to change, and then your product starts to change. So those are the solutions that we've seen RPO provide. Some of them surprising, some of them probably predictable, but either way, these are pieces that we see in almost every instance. So the effectiveness of RPO, and as mentioned in the introduction, where has it worked and where hasn't it worked? I think this is an important slide for a couple different reasons. Having done this for a while, we've seen relationships that didn't work and relationships that did work, and I think there's a lot of talk about, just as anything, any kind of new methodology comes into place, there can be good things said about it, bad things said about it. Of course, when you've got enough data to support things, it makes it easier. So I think now that we've had a good run, RPO actually has a title, that it's easier to take a look back, kind of look in that rearview mirror and say, okay, what happened in the past and how have we learned from that and where can we go from there? So here's where we've seen it hasn't worked. When it's been underpriced. So when RPO comes in and the RPO provider quotes a price, says they can do it, gets in there, figures out they can, client expects that it should be, and the company has to leave the situation. We've seen this happen with 2 very large organizations. I don't think anybody underprices intentionally. RFPs are always good incentives to underprice, but I don't think that anybody ever underprices intentionally, but it happens. Going hand in hand with that, the vendor partner underestimates the work. It's easy, I think, from anybody from an outside standpoint to say, well, this company needs to do this, this, and this to improve. If you don't do a lot of homework on the front end as the provider to figure out what it is that you think the company needs, and the company, and our next line is the company overestimates the work, and the company doesn't understand exactly what it is the RPO provider can do, well, then you've got a mismatch. Which leads to our 4th bullet, which is overestimation of reaching milestones. So that we've seen situations where organizations have come into an RPO relationship and expected that they were going to see an increase in the amount of hires within the first 2 to 3 months. And actually what happens in situations is once the RPO provider is in place, it might be internal pieces within the organization that have to change that take longer that they don't have an effect of. So I think coming in conservatively on the front end and saying, we'd like to reach this milestone by 3 months. Let's see where we are once we're in here, and then redefine it as we go along, or set separate timings for milestones is your best bet. The thing about milestones is if you set them and you stand concrete and this is what you want to reach and you don't reach them, it's disappointing. And for that to happen in the first 3 months of a partnership is very discouraging. So when we did an analysis of an RPO for a company that we were looking to partner with, what went wrong, we realized that the milestones just weren't attainable, and that led for a bad feeling all the way around, and the partnership dissolved. Wrong skill set of provider chosen. So I think as RPO has been growing, if a company says, I'm an RPO provider, and you're not exactly sure as a particular purchasing company what that RPO provider does, not all RPOs are the same. I think all of us are deciding who we are within the industry and figuring that out. And because, as you're noticing, RPO is so customized, it's important to find a partner that gets it, that gets you, that knows you, and really understands you. I don't think you'll get that information from an RFP. I think one of the biggest concerns that I see is that RPOs look a lot alike on paper. If we went back to the particular pieces that RPO solves, we all reduce time to fill. We all reduce cost to hire in most cases. But to the degree that you're looking for, the degree that your company needs, that's where the question comes in. So lots of times on paper, everybody looks the same. It's really important that you get to know them very well in the front end. Process design heavy. So an RPO at its best has a balance of recruiting talent, process engineering, and consulting if it's a third generation. That's the total balance of the three pieces. When you look at your organization and you say, we need somebody more weighted on the recruiting side, and you wind up going with a company that's more process-driven, well, then you're just buying more of the imbalance that you already have. So what's really important is to make sure that they have the exact balance of process design that you need and the exact balance of recruitment design that you need. To negate those two is becoming a big factor, causing the RPO not to work. The company's internal HR team is totally opposed to a partnership. It just doesn't work. If your team doesn't want to do this, if your team feels threatened, they'll make sure that it doesn't work. We have seen this happen. Fortunately for us, it hasn't happened to us, but we've seen this happen. We've sat in on many responses to proposals where the team really is not, their heart is not into it. So you've got to do your internal work first. The other point that I'll add is we've been called in by CFOs, we've been called in by CEOs, we've been called in by chief HR officers and sat around the table, and it's the objective of the C-suite to implement this, and it is not the objective of the people downline from the C-suite, and then it becomes a problem. So everybody's got to feel good about it up front. And there's lots of ways that you can do that, but it does take a little bit of time, and it's an important point that really needs to be acknowledged. When an RPO relationship is undermanaged, and this can be on either side, if the tie-ins into the partnership are not solid, so if the company is underestimated the type of individual that they need to plug into from their perspective, or the RPO provider has chosen the wrong person to plug into the company, those plugins are so critical, and that's really where the partnership revolves. So the partnership, if you look at that almost as the orbit, they're the center of the orbit, so they're the sun, so to speak. Those two elements have to have a good relationship, they have to work well together, and they have to have a good partnership concept. Otherwise, it doesn't work. New management arrives with different and new expectations. This is very interesting because we have seen RPO partnerships where they're humming, they're doing really well, management changes, a new person comes in, and one of the reasons that we do demystifying RPO is we've seen situations where new management comes in and says, I can do this with contract workers myself, not knowing the history or not knowing where the company has been, or I can do this through temporary employees, or I can do this with contingent staff, because really that's all RPO is. Well, the truth is RPO, hopefully you're learning today that RPO is much more in depth than that and quite different. So it's that misunderstanding we've seen back in 05, 06, 07 that caused a lot of confusion. As RPO has become a hotter topic and people are getting more educated, we're hoping that we see that go away. So now that we've talked about the bad points, where has it worked? When it's been project managed, well, I'm going to go back to that sun again. Project management is everything because customization is the key to an RPO. You've got to have people that are smart, good project management background that understand the balance that's needed as far as recruitment, consulting, and process engineering in your relationship. When that's done well, things are much easier. The whole operation runs well. When clear expectations are set up front, it's kind of understood, isn't it, right? If you go into any partnership, you want your clear expectations up front. I think the concern with RPO is it's easy to say that, but you don't always know what those expectations are until you're in there. So you need to give it a little bit of time. But when it's clear up front that we're going to expect the unexpected, then the partnership goes well. Buy-in is gained at all levels of the business lines. Now, I cannot tell you that we've ever walked into an RPO where absolutely every single individual that's related to the RPO is 100% on board and this is going to work. Some just don't care. Some don't think it's going to work. But for the most part, the main key players are on board, and they're able to help the RPO influence the other people involved and get more and more people in line. And then the quicker you can get everybody online and really sharing the partnership, the better it operates. Appropriate balance, as we talked about, a process recruitment with design. When escalation is seldom needed, the partnership works well. Escalation is a term that's used quite often within HRO partnerships, especially in contracts and in RPOs. So what do we do if it goes wrong? So if the RPO provider is saying, we've been trying to get this particular hiring manager to see candidates for the last 3 weeks, he's been unavailable, she can't commit to seeing them, where does the RPO provider go? On the other side, the hiring manager or an HR person is saying, hey, we've been expecting candidates, we've made a lot of requests, we haven't heard something. How do they escalate that? When you have the trust partnership, escalation is seldom needed because the parties are really communicating. But when we see a lot of escalation, that's an indicator that that could be a problem, that the relationship could be in jeopardy. Some companies like to call it noise, and there's a lot of people feeling I need to talk to somebody else because I can't get satisfaction. That's a point. So if there's a good escalation process in place, it should be used early on and hopefully dissolved, because as the partnership grows, you don't really need it. So where we don't see a lot of escalation, we see healthy and very prosperous RPO relationships. The client company and the provider are both well incentivized towards the same goals. Let me just say that one more time. The client company and the provider are both incentivized towards the same goals. So this kind of goes back to the management stance. So if the RPO provider knows it's our goal to provide really good candidates, they're going to materialize into higher productivity in this particular sales group. That ties directly into the business, and the HR folks are saying the same thing, and the business line is saying the same thing. We're all working towards the same goal. Now, if the RPO provider is working towards getting really good candidates, and HR is good with that, but the business is saying, I wanted somebody who knew more about sales, and that kind of getting fragmented, and they're thinking that the RPO should be doing something different than they already are, then that's where the confusion comes in. So the point is to keep everybody incentivized towards the same goals and know what those objectives are. Write them down, know them, learn them, do quarterlies to look at what the progress is towards them, and keep working towards the same goals. And then last but not least, the high trust level within the partnership is everything. So that's a gander at effectiveness within the RPO world. I'm just going to run through these quickly. I think that verbiage can scare everybody off. But the different types of RPO, the first that we'll talk about is enterprise. You'll hear the word enterprise solutions, which is kind of like, does that mean, is an enterprise solution mean that I take all of my recruiting and hand it out to a company? In our experience, we've seen the word used a lot of different ways. We will say that enterprise solution could be an end-to-end. So in other words, an RPO company can come in and take over all of your sales recruiting for a particular segment from beginning to end. Or they can take over all of your recruiting from your janitor all the way up to your CEO. What we would say to identify enterprise solutions is that the bulk of the continuum, or key pieces, a majority of the pieces of the continuum, go over to the RPO provider. Second, we have augmenting solutions, and this is where RPO partners fill in one or more of the gaps of the continuum. So this could be as easy as, again, is my background check company, are they augmenting me? Therefore, are they an RPO provider? Or maybe you have 2 or 3 pieces that are going out to different RPO providers, or different types of segments within the continuum are being funneled out to other companies. That could be considered augmenting RPO. Project RPO. This occurs when a company says, we're going to have a need to hire, just as that call center I was talking about, they're going to need to make 6,000 hires. If they weren't making that 6,000 hires, that particular company has a good internal bandwidth to do the rest. So really, they're looking for a project RPO provider who will come in and work with them for maybe the next 8 to 9 months and make sure that that is done, and then that will probably end. Not all RPO providers will do that type of work for you. It just depends on the nature of the work, so you need to look around for it. But there is project RPO that's available. And then provider-specific RPO. This is where it involves a particular expertise. So this goes down to assessment people who do specific parts of orientation. So that there's your provider-specific RPO. I think the best way to understand the different types of RPO is to move over to the models. And here's a graphic that we put together for you. In this particular case, the RPO partner manages all the recruitment resources. So if you think of these great buildings over here as your office, here's your RPO provider doing all your recruiting. Even the temporary employees, the contingent retained search, and the contractors are coming into the RPO provider. The RPO provider could come with their own vendor management system, their own ATS. This would be a full-scale enterprise. Or it could be that you're just managing your temporary employees, or just managing your contractors and doing all their recruiting, whichever. But this is a good example of a full-scale RPO. And this particular model This is an RPO, a national company, that's chosen to use 3 different RPO providers in 3 different regions. So this RPO provider is covering one region, this is covering region 2, and this is covering region 3. Now this could be RPO provider if we got rid of the word region and we just said this RPO provider is handling sales for us, this RPO provider is handling engineering for us, this RPO provider is handling customer care for us. Just to give you an idea of how diversified it can be. And here's a good example. This is actually a company that we work with. This is what our RPO looks like. They retain the recruiting onshore, they retain the recruiting in China, and they've chosen to use us as an RPO provider in these other continents. So they know their internal strengths, and they know where they have the internal strengths, and they know where they needed the assistance. So is RPO right for my organization? And this is, do you have challenges? Do you have recruiting challenges? What's making you interested in today is the first question that you could ask yourself. Here's a short test. Now you can go actually to our website and take this yourself. At the end, we'll give you a link. But this helps you define, okay, so I've got a sore spot. Let me go through the elements of the recruiting continuum: define, attract, recruit, candidate processing, interviewing, reporting, communications. Let me go through those, give myself a grade, and then after I've given a grade, take a look at the graph that appears for you. And this is an actual customer, so you can see the purple is the customer, and these are the pieces of the recruiting continuum that that customer owns, and this is the pieces that we're accountable for. So we're the green, they're the purple, and that gives you a good idea. They're reaching 100% efficiencies by augmenting where they don't have the internal strength with the RPO provider. Just going to take a second here to check for questions. Okay, got a couple, we'll get to those in a second. Okay, so pricing, cost savings, and contract terms, pricing models. There are, these are just some of the models that are out there. I would encourage you to ask a lot of questions about a pricing model, but there's per instance models. Per instance models means when we were talking about first level RPO, you could pay per resume, you could pay per placement, you could pay for 4 resumes or 4 qualified candidates. Those models typically are in that first or second level generation. When we move on to the second and the third level generation RPO, administrative costs, so a weekly cost, monthly cost is incorporated in there, a service fee, which allows the RPO to assign a definitive team specific to your company that does not necessarily change. So it's a well-planned team, and then they charge a per hire model as well. So a combination of those 2 pieces. SLA-dependent discounts can be part of the pricing model. So if the RPO meets the objectives in a certain time, then you could give you could bonus them for that, or at the same time, in the event that they don't, then they could actually have to charge pay back a penalty or a fee. Guarantees. So when you use the per hire model or per instant model, it's easier to offer guarantees. In an RPO relationship, guarantees are usually not 30 days. They're usually much longer, or in our opinion, they should be. As they tie to the business objectives, you can usually work out a longer guarantee period. Average savings would be for price per hire. Again, your cost of vacancies and your employee retention, those are 3 key metrics you would use to say, how am I saving money? How am I saving money? What does that look like? And then contracts. The notes that we have here are, let me just skip down to the first one, origin to execution. How long does it take to put a contract together? I think we've seen that get lower, but we've seen contracts themselves, which take anywhere from 12 weeks on to develop. Now, we would highly recommend anybody considering an RPO to do a pilot. A pilot is short, it's got a short contract, and it allows everybody to do a test run, so to speak, on the positions with that particular RPO provider to say, hey, well, what do we've learned, and now how can we build a good contract while we're doing this? And, you know, is it truly the right type of resolve for our company? So I will tell you that People Science doesn't enter into any long-term agreements without a pilot first, because we found that we get a lot of information from the pilot, as do the companies that we service, so I would strongly suggest that. And then a long-term RPO contract is built from the data that comes from the pilot. So that tells you a little bit about the length of intention. If you're doing any type of enterprise or significantly augmenting your RPO, it doesn't behoove you to walk into an agreement where you don't go for at least a year. I don't think the RPO contracts really should run less than 2 years. And your out clause needs to be relevant to what you're doing. I've seen situations where companies believe that it's good for them to have a 30-day cancellation in an RPO relationship. Most of the time, that's going to hurt the company more than it's going to hurt the RPO, because if you want to have some type of leeway in the event that you're not comfortable or you want to transition, and we've seen this happen too, where a company is ready to transition recruiting back themselves, but there's a good amount of time that it takes to do that. It's not as simple as payrolling or benefits. RPO is dealing with people, bundles of people, and a lot of different personalities. So that pretty much brings an end to our presentation. Here's our contact information that we talked about. I guess we have another 8 minutes or so, and we have some questions that have come in. Okay, first question. How much preparation is necessary to start an RPO? Well, if I go back to the pilot point, I think what you need to do first is know what your pain points are, know what your objectives are. If you have data on your cost per hire, it's going to help immensely. If you don't have data on your cost per hire, but you have data on any other factor within hiring, so if you know what it's costing you for contingent labor, what it's costing you for temporary to hire labor or contract labor, that's going to help. Any metric that you can bring in. But if you don't have it, I am sure that RPOs would be glad to start to talk to you about it, maybe even give you some guidance on it. You don't have to have all those pieces together, particularly if you do a pilot. It's a good thing to sit down and talk that out. I hope that answered your question. Describe the level of ongoing communications we can expect throughout the RPO. This is very company culture dependent. Some companies want to know every instance of everything that's going on with every single candidate, it seems, and then other companies want to have a different type of relationship. The important thing is to know what feels good for you as the purchaser. How much involvement do I want to have? And then look for a company that's going to give you that kind of involvement. The one thing that I would definitely say is, in the beginning, you're probably going to want a lot more information than you have, say, 6 months in. And this is very common. Whenever we start an RPO relationship, we're providing tons of metrics to a lot of different people. And then as soon as the trust factor establishes and everybody kind of gets their feet wet, reports change, they get redone, recustomized, and then metrics start to change too. Right? So we start to say, okay, this is what's really needed for us to come up with our final decision. I would say be patient in the beginning, but look for a partner that you feel good about. People who feel good in partnerships are the ones that do the best. So the skill level has to be there, but once you've equated and kind of equalized yourself with your skill level, you need to say, how do I feel about this particular company? Who are the people I'm going to be plugging into? What are the chances that they're still going to be in those positions? Because transition in these teams is important. So look at how long they've been there and try to get a feel. I strongly suggest you personally meet whoever you're really seriously considering. This is not something that you do just through a webinar. You should seriously sit down, get to know these people that you're going to be partnering with. Do you need an HRIS to effectively partner with an RPO? Absolutely not. There's RPOs that will bring them. I know internally we have ATSs that we work with. We have ATSs that we're partnered with, and we have our own internal ATS that augments ATSs because when it comes to recruiting metrics or everything. What approach would you take to source RPO vendor providers? I think the first thing that I would do is really discover who I am and what I'm looking for. Then I would hunt around the internet. Certainly today is a great time to do this. I think HR.com has done a good job of setting up booths. Go into those booths. I can't tell you, looking at these booths, that there's too many other RPO providers that aren't in this. So if you really wanted to take a look, that's where I would start. And then I would, knowing what it is you're looking for, start to ask questions of the providers to see if they fit it. And the caution I would offer is RPO is not a one-size-fits-all. So if you're getting the feeling that they're talking one-size-fits-all, then maybe you need to keep exploring. But certainly go into the conference today and take a look around. Can you partner with an RPO at different degrees based on the vacancy, i.e. third degree for more senior roles? Absolutely. I think one of the cool things that we're finding out about RPO is that it's versatile. we're working with an organization right now that has 2 other RPOs in there. And actually, those are set on skill sets as well. And there are RPOs that specialize in things that you might need. So you just need to make sure that you're getting what it is you're looking for. Let's do a check on time. 2 more minutes. Specifically, what type of metrics can you provide? Can provide the project? So what kind of metrics can be provided? Pretty much, it depends on the type of RPO you're working with. So you want to know what metrics are important to you. And different companies can provide different things. And actually looking at metrics is what is kind of a good telltale when you're evaluating RPOs to see if they fit what you're looking for. So some will give you very generic metrics, and then others will give you really minute, tiny information. So for example, they can go in and say, this is how many people that we've spoken to, and of the people we've spoken to, this is how many of them come from a diverse background. Or they can tell you, this is how many people I've decided to go with another company because of pay scale, or because of the geography of the position, or because of the skill level. This is why it took so long to find this position. So what's important to know is what your expectation is. And then I do think that measuring RPOs based on the metrics they can provide is a critical part. And I think that does it for our questions. I don't see any more coming up. Anybody else? Any other questions before we say goodbye as we're coming up on time? Okay. I'd like to thank you very much for attending. Again, this is our URL is People Science. We will be at hr.com today. You're welcome to stop by our booth for more questions, and we'll look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.